That's for years.
A lot of these programs.
Well, I guess that's a good fire. Yeah.
Attention, everyone. Oh, sorry. Louder than I expected it to be. But now I've got your attention. I just want to let you know that we're going to begin a few minutes later. There's still some people over at the bar up there. So we'll make sure to get those doors open, get some air in here as well. But just letting you know, we'll begin in a few minutes. We're just waiting for everyone to get settled. Thank you.
Not really. get it in for 6:35. But yeah, not really too many of these like discussion makes Johnson I like a mix of like educational and and then I would call myself a scholar. Yes, either a scholar that exceeds vulgarity or a scholar that studies vulgarity. I was sometimes like, there's no studying English word is really way to, which is a way to track yeah, number one, they say I think we should read this one outside. Do what? I think we should read this one outside. All right. Well, thanks for the program. Do you have a bigger space in this building? Or?
No, this is about as big as we have a smaller space than this too, but probably wouldn't be much help.
Well, I wasn't thinking about tonight, but just in general. Big building.
This is like our largest like gathering space, I guess you could say. We have a boardroom upstairs, also smaller.
It's really pretty. Overlooking the water. And,
yeah, especially like when you can like during the day or during sunset. It's beautiful. I think we'll get going. There's just 2 people left up there, so I'll get to the little intro now. All right. Good evening, everyone. If I could have your attention, please. So I want to welcome you all to our March installment of Think and Drink. Can you believe that? It's March already, right? Yeah. The weather is certainly starting to feel like it as well. But I would like to thank you all for coming out tonight and braving the wet and cold weather. And I really appreciate all of you being here and how full this room is tonight. This is an incredible turnout for us here at the Maritime Museum. So I do just want to thank you all for being here tonight. Now, the 2026 theme for Think and Drink is catastrophes and moments of resilience. These are moments of loss, survival, and transformation that leave lasting marks on people and places. This year's talks will span shipwrecks and storms, technological failures, and natural disasters. We will explore both well-known tragedies like the Titanic, come back in April, as well as lesser-known disasters that shape Wisconsin and our broader world. But we are pleased tonight to welcome Jed Meunier, right? Got it right. Awesome. He is an ecologist and research scientist with the Wisconsin DNR, and I will pass it right along to him then. But before I go, I would like to say that Think and Drinks, these free speaker series we have once monthly, every first Thursday of the month, are actually funded in part by a grant by the Green Bay Packer Foundation. So we thank them hugely for their support in this. And if anyone is interested in learning more about keeping these programs free and accessible to the public, you can find me or go to the front desk after the program tonight, and we'd be glad to tell you a little more information about donating or memberships. All right, now that's enough from me. I'd like to welcome Jed to the stage now.
I'm not sure if I should move this. How's that? That's pretty loud. Okay. All right. Wow. Thanks, you guys. So I have some bad news and some good news. The bad news is I'm pulling a bit of a bait and switch here, right? We splashed Peshtigo Fire and I'm gonna switch it up a little bit with I'm gonna make you listen to some ecology of fire as well. But I will talk about the Peshtigo Fire and as part of that. And then the other thing I think I'd like to switch, just because I'm having fun with this, I think I would switch resilience in moments of catastrophe, and I'll try to bring that point back. So this is kind of an interesting starting point that I've been using for various talks recently. So has anyone in here read or seen Braiding Sweetgrass, a really neat little book? Yeah, by Robin Wall Kimmerer. So this book is a cool book, but she's really talking about different plants and their meaning to indigenous cultures. And in the beginning of the book, she starts by talking about sort of the Haudenosaunee creation story. So think like northeastern tribes, Iroquois Nation, Six Nations, including the Oneida. But in this creation story, Sky Woman falls to Earth, and then the animals sort of rescue her and build what it becomes Earth. And she gives birth to she's pregnant when she falls to Earth. She gives birth to a child who in turn dies during childbirth. And her 2 twins that are born one represents creation and the other represents destruction. And I think this is an interesting sort of context. So her point really being that, you know, one isn't good and one isn't bad, but one gives context and meaning to the other. And so fire, in my mind, is this creative force. Our native communities are really, this country is a fire country. We're a fire continent. Ecosystems have evolved with fire. It's a natural part of our systems. Native indigenous cultures around the world, but particularly here, have used fire for all kinds of things. So it's a creative force. And as we know, if you're sitting here thinking about the Peshtigo Fire, it is also a force of destruction. And so Robin tells us our job is to try to understand those forces and keep them in balance. And so I warned you a little bit about the fire ecology part. So I'm going to mostly story tell, but I do want to set the stage with a little bit of sort of almost like textbook kind of ecology. And so I think this helps though. So like if you were to tell me a region of a mountainous geography and give me a rough elevation, and even if I had never been there before, let's just say, you know, the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana, some elevation, and I'd never stepped foot there, I could speak somewhat intelligently about its fire regimes because I can predict a couple of things. I know that as we go up in elevation, it gets colder, the air temperature gets colder. I know that warm air rises, and as warm air rises, it cools and it has to deliver precipitation because warm air holds more moisture than cold air. And so basically, because of an elevation, I can predict temperature and I can predict precipitation, which means I can predict to some level vegetation. I know that at the subalpine forest, these high elevation forests, that they naturally burn. So their ecology is that they have long intervals between fires, but when fires happen, boy, do they happen. And so lodgepole pine is a good example with its serotinous cone, which is sealed with resin. The fire kills the parent tree, but it melts those resins and opens the cone, and its seeds, which form the next forest, drop onto this perfect substrate. So that happens really long intervals. You go way down the mountain to the montane forest at lower elevations, and you get something more like ponderosa pine. You get really open forest. You have a lot of light getting to the ground. You have, you know, fine fuels, grasses and flowers that burn readily. So that forest could burn any given year probably. It's dry enough for part of the year to burn. It just needs ignition and the right conditions to really spread. And so and it burns frequently with low severity. So down the mountain, so let's think about it in terms of risk and hazard. If your house were at high elevation, you're probably not ever going to see a fire in your lifetime that you have to worry about. But if you do, meaning it has low risk, but if there is a fire, your house is going to burn to the ground. So high hazard, low risk, high hazard. If your house is down the mountain in the montane forest, you might see 5 fires in your lifetime or a handful, but you have a pretty good chance of defending it with a garden hose. So high risk, low hazard. So that's just kind of like background to think about these things ecologically. And so we don't have the elevation that the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana have, but we have all the things that I just talked about and many that I didn't talk about and more. So we have all those different ecologies, those fire regimes, those plant communities. They're just mixed up. Wisconsin's just a far more interesting, frankly, in some ways, and difficult place. And so these are ecological landscapes formed by, you know, soils and glaciation history, et cetera, but they represent similar plant communities. And so when we think about fire-dependent plant communities in Wisconsin, you know, I bet a lot of us would jump to tallgrass prairie, oak savanna, maybe some pine barrens, you know, northern savanna essentially. But these are really fire-dependent communities, and we know that without fire, these things won't exist. You know, I mean, we turned a lot over with, you know, into soybeans and corn, et cetera, but really we've lost a lot of prairie and oak savanna just because of lack of fire. If you don't burn them regularly, they're going to turn into brush, which then turns into forest, and they're just not going to exist. So they're fire dependent. We know at some level we understand that without fire, we probably wouldn't have these communities. But what about our forests, right? What's the ecology of our forests? So this is a grainy picture, even when it's not projected, but let's see. I'm gonna use one of my tree cores as a pointer. But hopefully you can see at the bottom of the picture, there's 3 men standing at the base of these charred bowls. And then, this is from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And I'm gonna highlight here something that I'll talk more about, but there are these basal injuries. There are these triangular shaped injuries that are indicative. Like, you do not get those. They are completely indicative of the picture I showed you at the low elevation of high frequency, low severity fire regimes. And so this is the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The quote comes from Northwest Wisconsin, but clearly this is a really open forest, mixed pine conifer forest, and it had, apparently, judging from those basal injuries, relatively frequent low severity fires. But the reason we don't have many pictures like that or know more about them is because, and the density, it doesn't matter, but this is a forest, is because of this. This part of the history we all know, right? This is this really rapid change with European settlement. And so I've listed some of the more common sort of big fire years in the lake states. One thing I'll note a couple of things, but the first thing I'll note is that as an ecologist, I talk about fire years, not fire events generally. Now, I'm going to make an exception, and we will talk about the Peshtigo Fire, and that's a fire event. But that's a good example. 1871 probably burned 3 times as many acres in Michigan, but we get the naming rights because most people died here. 1894, the picture on the right there, that's the aftermath of the Hinckley, Minnesota fire. People died in Wisconsin near Sainer and Phillips in 1894. We too burned in 1894, but we don't get the naming rights because it was the most destructive fire in Minnesota's history, I think, the Hinckley, Minnesota fire. So my point being, you can have fires burning over big areas. So they're not necessarily the same fire, the same event, but they're these big fire years. The other thing, so with this history, what we learn and what we think about is, we have these massive changes happening rapidly, and all these forests cut down and then oftentimes burned. And it's the slash. And it's the fire in this case was kind of the ultimate degradating force with these sort of land uses and land abuses. The picture on the top left is river lumbering. So we started by cutting conifers, pines primarily, because they would float, because we didn't have railroads set up initially, and we had to move them. So we had to move them downriver. So they're waiting in this picture for spring breakup, and then those logs will get floated downstream. And so that's the way we moved lumber. So the initial cutting was river lumbering. And then once we were able to get railroad linked up to all these different places, we could then get in and cut hardwoods, and eventually there would be a tannery for hemlock. And so we did a pretty good job of cutting over our forests. But really, we think about these fire and cutover as being inextricably linked. And so 1894 was the picture I just showed you of the Hinckley fire. But 1895 was a decent sized fire year in the lake states as well. It wasn't so destructive, so it's not in our collective history or imagination quite like those other years I had listed. But it's well documented that the smokes in Lake Michigan were creating hazardous conditions, including this 307-foot vessel stranded on Gray's Reef in Lake Michigan in 1895 because of all the smoke in the atmosphere. So these are probably lots of big fire years, lots of destruction, and really just problems generally. And so something had to be done about that. I'm gonna set that down, or I'll just keep twiddling it, playing with it. You guys will just watch me. So we had to do something about all these destructive fires. And as part of the 1880 census, we added on what is now the Sargent Report and Sargent Map. So we commissioned the creation of a report, a map, to show what is the magnitude of the problem we have to fix. The proportion of woodlands burned in 1880 is what came out of that. And this is a map of that. The darker colors showing more, higher proportion burned. But really, I think the things of note are the uncolored areas in this map are just not wooded. So this whole country was burning, and fire was certainly not it didn't belong to the western states as we think of it now, often doing, but was a phenomenon of the eastern United States. So really this map, I think, is fascinating, but it also, the reason we have it is because to fix a problem, you have to sort of define it, right? So this was the magnitude of the problem we had to fix. And fix it we did. So long before Smokey Bear, there were really targeted efforts at fire suppression. One of them that maybe is lesser known were called the Dixie Crusaders. And there were these multiple parades that weaved back and forth across the Deep South. They handed out literature, they, all kinds of propaganda. They showed picture films many times to communities that hadn't even heard radio yet. And so they were sort of preaching like, we've got to end this habit of woods burning. It's estimated that in 1925, 21 million acres were burning in the Southeast, and by 1965, 600,000 acres. Now, just as a side note, the Southeast United States has some of the most fire-loving plant communities anywhere on Earth, certainly in North America. They've got the longleaf pine system, which burned every year to 3 years, even more frequently than our tallgrass prairies in many cases. So the Southeast is fire is a really natural part of that system, but we did our best to snuff it out. And of course, it wasn't limited to the Southeast. I love this picture because, I'm using an old sign that says cat face. So the thing I didn't tell you about those basal injuries, those triangular shaped injuries at the base of trees, we often call them cat faces because of the turpentine industry in the Southeast. Turpentine was collected, so they would they cut these grooves in the tree, and they often had these basal injuries, these cat faces. And then when the next fire would blacken those, they'd look like whiskers on a cat's face. At least I think that's why they're called cat faces. But walking away for just a minute, so hopefully you can see, so this is probably a 400-year-old or older ponderosa pine, old growth ponderosa. It's a Forest Service employee posting a basically no fire, warning on this tree with a cat face on it, indicative of how many fires it had seen in its lifetime. But so this is a cross section, not the same tree, of something like that. And basically you get the cambium, these trees are well protected from fire. They have thick bark, their branches are way up high. They're meant to burn and survive fire. But once in a while, the cambium, the growing tissue under the bark, gets hot enough to form an injury, and then it creates this wound, and the tree tries to heal over it. And once a tree's wounded like that, it's really easy to be re-wounded. And so this tree lived through, this particular cross-section. You can see it was burned half its circumference, and then the tree tried to grow over it. It burned again, and then barked. So anyways, as a tree ring person, did that go off, or is it still? It went off. Uh-oh. You want me to be loud? There's a lot of.
I heard a pop, might be the battery.
Yeah.
But I think I might have. Leo! Oh, sorry, Leo.
No.
He'll get us all fixed up. I bet I just turned it off.
Oh, all right.
No, it doesn't look like it though. Nothing. I'm making Leo work. He's really working tonight. Poor guy. He had to. Yeah. Anyways, but I can project for a moment. Can you guys in the back hear me a little bit? All right. So I'll try to keep rolling here. But so, anyways, these are cat faces. They're these these injuries on trees, and I love this stuff. I'm a tree ring guy, so I get really excited. And I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that. Is that one working?
I think this one's working.
All right, the same one or no?
Different one.
Okay, you got me?
Yeah.
Okay, yay! Thank you, Leo.
Yeah.
So now I've showed you a little bit of the Southeast and then jump to the West. So now coming closer to home, this is a sign in Minnesota, in the Northern Forest, and a quote from our chief forester somewhere around that time, around the turn of the century, Gifford Pinchot. But really, it's saying, like, if you're deliberately setting fire to the woods, you're going to get a $5,000 fine. And in 1910, $5,000 was like $175,000. So now think about this in terms of the Haudenosaunee creation story, indigenous cultures, or really anybody, a farmer trying to clear their land. So there were a lot of reasons why we had to get a handle on fire suppression, but boy, did we ever do a good job of it. And it's yeah, I mean, some of the earliest laws in this country were set up around disposal of logging waste, of slash, and of cooperative fire agreements, the 1911 Weeks Act, the Clark-McNeary Act. So we really got busy with formalizing this fire exclusion. And this is data that Greg Nowacki and Mark Abrams. It's just showing this precipitous drop after the 30s and 40s. But I don't think it's too big of a stretch to say that conservation, certainly forestry in Wisconsin, set the stage for the country, and it's based in more than anything fire suppression #1 and tree planting #2. And in many cases, we've been slow to evolve from that, really. So this is a picture of one of the earliest nurseries up in Vilas County, 1911, and our fire towers. And so if we fast forward and get closer to the present, there's a professor at Minnesota, Lee Frelich, and he's estimated that we have 0.6% of quote unquote relatively intact pine remaining in the Lake States. And so we still have our 3 native pines, jack pine, white pine, and red pine, but they're nowhere near an abundance of what they were. And hemlock I would throw into that same basket. But so this is some data by Lisa Schulte Moore and Dave Milanoff, just showing sort of the relative dominance from about the time of settlement, 1860 or so, to the current. And it's like we still have pines, we still have pine forests, but they're nothing near what they were historically. Is really, and we don't know a lot about them. We cut them all down before we really had a chance to observe them. And so when it comes to disturbance, when it comes to fire ecology, a lot of what we know. How many have heard of the General Land Office Public Land Survey notes, the GLO notes? Okay, all right. Well, so when in Wisconsin from 1832, I think it was 1832 or 33 to 66, but it varies depending on what state you were in. But during this time of European settlement, in order to privatize the public domain, we had to survey the entire country. And so in Wisconsin, it ranged from those years, and they sent out surveyors, and it gave us the modern day township range and section. That's where that came from. So when I talk about the original land survey or the GLO, I'm talking about the General Land Office, that original 1800s survey of what we had. And they were not interested in ecology, but some things that they did do is they had really detailed notes. And so, we have a really standardized method of understanding the land, because they took witness tree records. So at each section corner, they took a witness tree in each section to mark the corner. So the number of paces, what type of tree it was, and they blazed on the tree the actual township range and section. And so we have some idea of forest conditions based on their survey. And so this is interpretation of data like that by Lisa Schulte again and her advisor Dave Milanoff, Wisconsin. So if you take forest ecology, or if you're a forester in this state, you learn about the importance of wind throw, and it's largely from work like this. It's interpreting those notes. And so, the rotate, and then they also tried to estimate fire, and fire rotation intervals range from many hundreds of years in our pioneer landscapes to thousands of years, right? And so a long-winded way of saying what we think now about our northern forests is that they just don't burn very often. And you'll hear words like the asbestos forest. They don't burn, but every 3,000 years. Are you with me, more or less? Okay. And so sticking with this pine theme again, I think about the way that we manage pine, whether it's a natural origin pine, like the picture on the left, or a plantation on the right, it's exactly the same. And it's really based on the same stuff. We might thin it and then come in and thin it again. And usually if it's a plantation, those thinnings are every other, every third tree or every other row, thin it a couple times, and then we usually whack it down, herbicide it, furrow it, and replant it. And so the natural origin stands, we thin, and maybe harvest, but we actually don't know how to regenerate red pine naturally. We think we do, but we've not done it, at least at scale and on purpose. And so what we're doing here is this model is a production. It's a yield model. We're maximizing growing space for each individual. We assume that the things that, that these were always simple, like you had some kind of a punctuated mortality event, wind throw followed by severe fire, and a punctuated recruitment event, recruitment meaning tree birth, they originate again. So it's a really simple stand. So in some ways, plantation, natural origin, what's the difference? And fire, probably didn't have a big role in there. But you know where I'm going with this. I showed you that gritty, grainy picture with the three guys in the, from the UP. Well, this is where my work comes into it. And I'm most of these trees, this is a 400-year-old red pine, like in northeast Wisconsin, not far from here, actually, Marinette County, Camp Bird. Anybody know Camp Bird? Yeah, all right. So this tree came from Camp Bird, and actually that's one of the coolest old growth stands I've ever seen. It's small and fantastic. And it's so funny, I'm gonna go on a digression, is that okay? There's a tree there, there's a newspaper article that came out in in 86 or 89, and they called it the Monarch of Marinette. They thought it was a hazard tree, so they cut it down. And at the time, it was 389 years old, and this was decades ago. Well, this is one of its, compadres here, the one I'm sitting next to. Anyways, a beautiful forest. But we don't have much of those left because they look like those other pictures. We generally cut them down, right, and floated them down rivers or whatever, hauled them out of the woods. And so when that process that I told you of those cat face, those basal injuries, one thing the tree does, especially red pine, its Latin name is Pinus resinosa, so it's a real resinous pine to begin with, it secretes tons of pitch. It floods that injury with pitch like we would trying to form a scab, and it basically turns into amber. And so these stumps, even though the whole tree's rotted away, sometimes the only thing remaining is that fire-scarred bit. And I brought a few of them in here with me that you guys should take a look at. But so, and if I get lucky, I can go out, take a cross section of those stumps, and then I can date them and date each individual fire event. A lot of areas we don't have any of these stumps left, right? In some cases we tried to farm much of the North Forest and with varying degrees of success or failure. But we also had programs of just blasting out stumps. The College of Ag would actually go out and blast out stumps out of fields, and they used 19 million pounds of explosives by UW-Cals just to help people blow up stumps, right? So my job got much more difficult, guys, but they're still there in places. So I want to go back to this idea of dendrochronology and tree rings. Dendrochronology is a big fancy word. Dendro, Latin for tree, chronology is the study of time. And this is how we do it. So when I went out into the woods and I found this stump, I have no idea when this tree grew, lived, or died, right? None. But I can take it back to my lab and I can shine it all up and make it pretty. And then I can measure all the tree rings from the center of the tree out. And then I can take really old trees like living cores. Like, let's just say, for example, this tree is a really old living tree, and its innermost rings might overlap with the outermost rings of this longer dead stump, etc. So this is the process of cross dating. So we learn the narrow ring patterns, drought years through hundreds of years. So I now have tree ring and fire history going back to 1326 for the lake states, and I think I have wood back into the 1200s, but I haven't been successful yet in getting it cross dated. And so it's really cool. It's kind of fun. It's like puzzles. And I'll tell you what, though, I did my PhD work on tree rings and really difficult wood to date. And I used to dream at night. I would say, okay, there's a fire scar. Is it 1747? And I'd count forward and backward to 10, 7, 8, 9, 18, 1750. No, that doesn't look right. And I'd go the other direction and I'd try to cross date in my sleep. I wouldn't recommend that. And so I've got wood like this from all over Wisconsin. Now I'm well over 1,000 samples, and these are some of the pins from places that I've worked, and I think I've added pins, but I want to talk about a subset of these for a minute. So I'm gonna basically stay with these eight. Are there 8? 2, 4, 6, 8. Yep, 8 sites, 2 in each of these sort of ecoregions of Wisconsin, central sands, northeast sands, so I'm going to talk about these data. And so in those 8 plots, we did these really intensive measurements. We took tree cores. So you can take cross sections with a chainsaw of stumps, but you can also do a hollow drill and take out a little pencil-sized core. This is glued into a strip of wood, so it looks more substantial than when you pull it out of the tree. But so with tree cores, you can core everything, and then I take any kind of remnant wood, logs, snags, stumps. I would take a piece like this, and I can get a pretty good estimate. I can grow that stand back in time. And so what I've done here is I said, in this case, the density of trees today versus, how many trees based on tree rings were there in 1860 and get some estimate. And so these 8 stands, you guys, are like our best of the best. These are like our old growth sites, like a Camp Bird I talked about. And what we're finding is that they're up to 37 times more dense today than they probably were, 100 years ago or so. And that's pretty much uniformly true, on average 12 times more dense. And these are some of our best, right? That shouldn't be super surprising, given what I'm about to show you, which is the fire history. Now, I don't want you to panic. I'm going to show you graphs. I will explain them. They're not that complicated, but you can stop me if you need me to slow down. So I'm using. What's that? You want me to get to Peshtigo? I'm about to. I'm right there. I'm right with you. I told you it's going to be. It's more thinking and less drinking tonight. I'm sorry. Oh, we'll get there. I got to get there sooner. The rotten veggies or fruit are going to start flying. So this graph, the graph here that I'm showing you, the bottom are these bars, and those are born-on dates. I'm calling it recruitment, right? How many? And so this is getting after this idea that these stands were historically simple, and we really do think they were simple. This is the common thought of our pine stands, is that they're just not that interesting, But so the bottom, the dark black are the red pine, and then the lighter ones are the white pine, Pist, Pinus strobus, and then deciduous is lumped. And basically it's showing that we had continual recruitment over time in the midst of continual fire. So let me walk away for just 1 second. So this graph here is showing you, so now for this site, and I have these for all these sites, this is called a fire history graph. So now each one of these lines is a stump, and in some cases a recently dead or a living tree. And so I can say for all these trees, now the fire dates are these inverted triangles, and I can say, show me the fires that occurred on 10% or more of the samples that I have for a given time. And then I can calculate statistics based on these composites, like what's the mean fire return interval of fires that occurred on 10% of the trees or whatever. And so here's the next thing I'll show you is, so this sample right here, the one that I picked up, this is that line on that graph. This is a stump, and I've dated all the different fires, and they're now on that graph, right? So this is from the Togatik River in northwest Wisconsin. That's what that looks like. And so what that's showing us is that these forests and these are trees that lived through, this sample lived through all those different fires, and then we cut it down. So these are fires that were low severity. These are low severity fires worth keeping in mind, but they're really frequent, right? So it's getting after that picture again. So in other words, this is exactly the opposite of the way we think about pine and pine systems in Wisconsin. That they didn't have punctuated mortality and punctuated recruitment. They had continual mortality and continual recruitment. So it's really completely upside down the way we're thinking about it. Okay, a couple more nerdy things, and then we're getting to the Peshtigo Fire. And I'll admit it, this is really nerdy, but it's super important. And so this is some results of the spatial analysis. The analysis doesn't really matter, but the red line is our hypothesis, the dotted line, and that's completely spatially random. And remember, we took these really intensive measurements on these 8 different plots that I've been talking about, and we grew them back in time, and we spatially mapped all the stems. And so the top one's showing you the historical forest and their spatial pattern, and the bottom one is the forest today. And so historically, these trees were all clumpy, groupy. They were really heterogeneous. They were not uniform. So if climate and competition were the drivers, we'd expect them to be elbowing each other out for maximum space. Sounds like the yield model I talked about, but they're not. They weren't doing that at all. They were clustered. And I'm going to come back to this point and tell you why I think that's most important. And it gets at the title slide. This is about resilience, guys. So resilience in the face of catastrophe, right? I did a little flip on that. But anyway, so these forests are really quite different. And so now we're getting to the good stuff. Hopefully it was worth the wait. So what I've done here is I've taken all those 30 trees from Togatic River that I've talked about, and I've mashed them into one line. And I said, show me the biggest fires within a site. And I did that for all 8 of these sites. And now the composite, those dates at the bottom, these are massive fires. So now I'm saying it's a composite of composites. And so I'm saying like the biggest fire years, and you're looking at them. Does anyone recognize any of those years? Come on. 1871, I'm hearing. I like to hear that. When I present to 15-year-olds, they're all like, Peshtigo Fire. Like they're amazing. They're still learning about it. But 1910 was a big fire year. That was the biggest. We don't know about it here because not many people died, but it burned a lot of area, 1910, in this region. But we know about it in the Northern Rockies because that's where Ed Pulaski forced his crew down by gunpoint and held them down face down in a mine shaft and saved their lives. They were hearing the roar of the fire come over them and the oxygen getting sucked out of the mine shaft, and they were starting to panic. And he said, the first person who gets up, I'm going to shoot him dead. And he literally saved their lives, face down, breathing in a little air pocket in a mine shaft. That was 1910, biggest known fire year in the Northern Rockies ever, right? Okay. So you're with me now. I like that. All right. 1780 was a cool one too. 1780 was a really big year, especially in this part of the world, in this northeast Wisconsin. But it was big all over. There's fire scar evidence from the Ozarks, east, all through the eastern United States. 1780 was a huge fire year in the Lake States and southern Canada. And I'm not going to go into these details, but it burned under conditions a lot like the 2023 Canada fires did, actually. It was a flash drought, and I'm not going to talk about that. But 1780, the conditions were such that on the eastern seaboard, the sun was blackened out in the middle of the day. Chickens were going to roost. People thought it was the rapture, the second coming of Christ. They were running to church. Nobody knew what to make of it. It literally is in the newspapers, and you're reading part of a newspaper account there. But because the eastern seaboard was settled, we have these records from newspaper accounts. And so it wasn't until later on that afternoon that the smoke descended on the East Coast, and then I think an inch of ash fell over 3 states. And this was from the fires burning right here in Wisconsin, in the Lake States and Canada. So this is kind of like corroborating evidence of those big fire years that I was highlighting. And here it is. Hopefully it was worth the wait. Now I'm really going to get some rotten things thrown at me in a minute, but let me just get there first. So the most destructive fire in terms of human life, maybe in history, certainly our history, right? The Peshtigo Fire, October 8th. So it's really interesting. Like we think about this fire, and there's a lot of sort of hyperbole, a lot of interesting storytelling and beliefs formed around it. But I want you to look at that map. You guys know that map better than me. You live here, right? So look at the north of Green Bay. What about those place names? Anybody know what a sugar bush is?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to talk about that. Okay. So this is the Peshtigo Fire, another one of those big fire years, and we see it in our tree ring record. And so I think what's amazing. So somebody, when we were waiting for this to begin, we were talking about the Peshtigo Fire Museum. I dropped into the Peshtigo Fire Museum and I found a map of the big map here, the burnt district of 1871. And what I love about this map is it's showing, so my fire history work, the trees that survived the Peshtigo Fire were in what is today the Menominee Reservation, what is today Marinette County, what is today Oconto County. I have records of 1871 in all three of those locations. And so you're seeing the burnt district of 1871. This is sort of, emphasizing that point, the difference between, if you're a firefighter, you're responding to a fire event. But if you're a fire ecologist, you think about fire years. And what's cool, so anyways, this is just amazing, right? Caused by rail workers clearing land. And there's even newspaper accounts that talk about on Sunday evening, they were clearing the railroad, and that it drew. So what we know about the Peshtigo fire of year rather than the event is that there were fires burning the entire month of September, hundreds of fires burning all over northeast Wisconsin and elsewhere, and that there was a lighthouse on Green Island in Green Bay that was running its strobe 24/7 to keep ships from wrecking because of all the smokes. Going back to that idea of some of the smoky hazards. So this idea that it was caused by a particular railroad worker at a particular time and place is hogwash. There's no evidence for that. There were probably railroad worker fires all over, but it wasn't a event. It was meaningless. We had hundreds of fires burning, and 1871 was the second year of what is for our region a prolonged, pretty severe drought, fueled by pine slash in the woods. I'm going to come back to this point on my next slide, but I'm just going to leave that as an unlikely hanger. This idea that it's the forgotten fire, and my colleagues in the DNR talk about this. We love to talk about this, and it is an important part of the story. Peshtigo was completely isolated. They were alone, burnt, and alone, and needing help for a period of time. But once word got out and it, became known what happened in Peshtigo, aid arrived and help arrived. And this idea that it was the forgotten fire, maybe for 3 days, right, or less, but it's one of the most famous, best known fire events in history, actually. So I'm going to say for a few days on that one. We're just going to give it that, right? And then you will hear accounts of the fire jumping across Green Bay. And this is our desire to put this into a simple box, that it was a fire event, not a big fire year, that that somehow it just, but it's not. There were hundreds of fires burning. It wasn't a single ignition. And it also burned where we are here, basically, on the Door Peninsula or close. But it probably didn't jump. And then anomalous time in October. And I'm not going to spend any time on this point, but I have what I didn't tell you about tree rings and fire. I can tell not only the year fires burned, but I can oftentimes figure out the time of year based on the position of the fire scar within an annual ring. And let's just say the big fire years, fall, summer fires were really common. The Hinckley, Minnesota fire was September, October, and you go through the list, there were a lot of fall fires. And then you look at Wikipedia for Peshtigo, you get some crazy stuff like it was a meteorite and there's blue flames and but let's just say it's unlikely. So I want to come back to this idea of pine slash in the woods. So I set the stage a little bit thinking about the General Land Office, the original land survey, and those witness trees. So I took the perimeter, the boundary of the high severity portion of the Peshtigo fire, those 1.2 million acres, and I overlaid it on the General Land Office notes. So I pulled out all the witness trees that occurred in that perimeter, that footprint, and I mapped them, or I graphed them. And so there were 11,014 witness trees in those 1.2 million acres. And the number one species is hemlock, followed by cedar, beech, tamarack, sugar maple, white pine, black ash. There was very little pine in that landscape in 1871. And there's still very little pine. They're there. We still have white pine, jack pine, and red pine. But and so this idea that, and the other thing of note, in 1871, we were just about to link the railroad coming up from Green Bay and into Peshtigo. And in 1871, there were lots of spur railroads. We were starting to get deeper into the pine, but they hadn't all been connected to a main rail line yet. They would be soon. But the idea being that we were mostly river lumbering. We weren't harvesting hardwoods at any scale in 1871 in this area. So So the idea that this was pine slash, I don't think it quite adds up. There was definitely slash. There was definitely holes being punched in the woods, even, if regardless of whether there was pine. But this simple narrative of we, cut all the pine down and the pine slash burned, and I don't think it actually holds up under more scrutiny, or at least it's not the most interesting part of that story. And so thinking about this in terms of that original sort of, wind and fire using the General Land Office record. So we, these landscapes that I've been talking about, those piney landscapes, the Northeast Sands, the Northern Highlands, Northwest Sands, we think about them in terms of hundreds to thousands of years between fire events. And based on my fire scar records of like how long it would take to burn the entire Northern Highlands, some parts of it may not burn at all, others might burn 5 times, but the equivalent area based on tree ring records and low severity fire is 34 years, not 4,000 years. And so this is an idea that we have way overestimated the importance of maybe wind and high severity fire, and undervalued the importance of low severity fire. And so I want to think about that a little bit. So this is the lower Wisconsin, closer to where I drove from. And it's Battle of the Wisconsin Heights. So as Black Hawk and his Sauk Indians came back over the Mississippi River, and they were trying to get to their homeland on southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois, and they had this long retreat, lots of battle. It did not go well for Black Hawk, and it was probably the last big Indian battle this side of the Mississippi River in the eastern United States. But anyways, one of the battles was on this bluff, Black Hawk Bluff. And this is not, the first picture on the left is probably around 1900. And then I don't know the exact years of the others, but it's roughly a chrono sequence, right, today. And so from what I've told you, if your house was on the picture on the right, you would probably be able to, it might burn because lots of sun getting to the ground, lots of herbaceous plants. Granted, it looks rather grazed in that picture, but you could carry fire and it would probably burn, and you could probably protect your house with a garden hose. What about the picture on the far right? It's a different scene, right? It's going up the mountain. We're far less likely to have a fire on the picture on the right because you have this canopy, and it's less sunlight getting to the ground, and it's more wet, takes longer to dry out. But if you do get a fire, if you do get those conditions, you're going to have the opposite situation. You're basically trading risk for hazard is this idea, thinking about it in those lines. And so I want to come back. So why didn't our forests all burn down? Why didn't, these fires that I've been showing you burn down our forests like we think of them as potentially doing today if we had those same kinds of fires? Because remember, I'm showing you mostly data from trees that lived through those big fire events. So why are they there? And I also showed you the really nerdy data about the spatial patterning historically and current. So what we're finding is that lots of taxpayer dollars are going to what we call hazardous fuels mitigation. We're thinning the woods in the western United States to prevent homes from burning down in this wildland-urban interface. And what we know now from modeling and also from empirical evidence of wildfires is that with enough wind, the forest on the left can still sustain crown fire in many cases. If all you do is change the pattern of those trees, you still have the same number of trees, you haven't changed anything but the spatial patterning of them, it's virtually impossible to sustain crown fire when you have that clumpy, groupy, small openings, medium openings. So the fire drops to the ground and behaves. So fire was the mechanism that created this complexity spatially in the forest that then in turn protected it from the subsequent fires. So fires are less likely to carry as crown stand replacing fires because fires have created this sort of complexity. So I know it's a nerdy concept, but it really is important. We're talking, I told you I was flipping the script here, right? Catastrophe and cases of resilience, and I'm talking about resilience and cases of catastrophe. This is how we prevented ecological catastrophe. And so last bit of nerdy data, and this one's a whopper. But so I've been showing you those 8 sites in Wisconsin, and now I borrowed data from colleagues from Brian Pollock and Sean Fravor in Minnesota. And these are 7 old growth stands in Minnesota. So now we've got a bigger area, and I'm showing you data, historical data from Minnesota. And so that bottom line is distance. And so what we're doing, we're turning our work, this is more reference data, but we're actually developing a new type of silviculture based on these results. And so I don't know if you can see my mouse, maybe I can just do this. So really a canopy of a mature red pine is about 6 meters, and this is in meters. So at 1 meter, historically, the trees were, you know, if we think about 1 meter being the minimum distance rule, every tree was an individual. They were far enough apart from another individual to not be considered part of a clump. And so reading across this at 6 meters, which is the canopy of a mature tree, you generally get a mix of trees that are individuals, trees that are in small clumps and medium clumps, and sometimes large clumps. So there's variability in this data. And the important part here is at 6 meters, you get this really big mix of small, medium, large clumps and individuals. Today, at 6 meters, it's solid dark blue. It's one large clump. And so thinking about this in terms of, you know, resilience, et cetera, and we're actually turning this now into new silvicultural systems. But anyways, so we have a mechanism, I think, for generating resilience. And so I would just encourage us, like, the human lifespan is so short, you guys. Like, I think about, you know, look at all this historical data, and you're all probably starting to do an eye roll by now, thinking, oh my God, is he in the deep end? But, you know, it's not like, it's coming back. Like, fire is going to be a part of our future. That 2023 Canadian fires, here's my pet peeve with that. Like, if you listen to the media, the way they talk about that fire year, and we were sucking on smoke for weeks down here, right? It's all a severe drought, a prolonged drought. That is absolutely true in Western Canada. In BC and in Alberta, they were in a prolonged drought. In Quebec and Ontario, half of those acres, 75,000 square miles of land was in Eastern Canada. And guess what? They had a wet winter followed by a wet early spring and an unprecedented May-June drought, just like 1780. And they were sucking on smoke, and we were sucking on smoke, and they were evacuating capitals. You know, I mean, so the point being, like, Eastern Canada and Western Canada, two very different, they were all on fire and burning, but the conditions were absolutely different. So I think we've got to get out of this mindset of complacency, like that's just a thing of the West, or, you know, that's not happening here. And so anyways, there's more and more evidence. We've had, you know, some really interesting fire years in 2023 and in 2024, and those fall fires burning in weird places. And I just think, like, you know, a 2,000-mile long smoke plume over the Atlantic Ocean from Eastern Canada, that's something to pay attention to. So it's not just totally pie in the sky, right? And then I'm going to end here. I think, you know, this isn't Amanda Gorman, who is an inaugural poet for Obama, but I really liked her words about, like, being American is more than the pride we inherit, it's the past we step into and how we repair it. And I think we can apply that to human communities and natural communities. And the kicker is, what we're, you know, like, working with land and restoring landscapes to be more resilient, it makes our human communities more resilient. Just the mere act of restoring land is restorative to ourselves and each other. So there's a whole cool thing, you know, there's a lot of neat stuff happening here with indigenous burning, but just, you know, with land restoration and land management. And it's fantastic. And I think we can scale that up. And then this is a picture of Aldo Leopold and his students burning the UW Arboretum around 1940. And, you know, Leopold has, like, he wrote adamantly about the ills of fire and wildfire. He really thought fires were bad, universally, basically. And he used this sort of derogatory term called Paiute forestry, which came from actually Southern Pacific Railroad. There's a long history there, but so he publishes this paper saying fires are bad, it's the scourge of the forest. And then he starts to change his mind. So he's trying to figure out the erosion problem in the southwestern United States. And he comes to the conclusion that grass holds soil better than juniper or, you know, trees. And he basically, In 1924, he writes this sort of epic paper where he puts it all together. And in it, he says, forest administration were based on an incorrect interpretation of the ecological facts and were therefore in part misdirected. The problem which faces us constitutes a challenge to our technical competency as foresters, a challenge we've hardly as yet answered, much less actually attempted to meet. And I think this is a perfect analogy for what we're dealing with pine. We don't know how to regenerate red pine. We really don't. We don't know how we're going to manage it going forward. We assumed that it was a simple system. It was single cohort, single aged, and it had, it all fell over and then was all born again. And it's not actually how it happened. And so we can meet this challenge. That's what I got. So that's a bait and switch, wasn't it? Yeah. But do you have questions? Thoughts? I read the Peshtigo, the Firestorm book, though. Go ahead.
Largest tree in Wisconsin.
Largest?
Tree in Wisconsin.
Of any species?
Mm-hmm.
Is this a quiz for me?
I was under the impression that every county
Oh,
has a registered tree.
yeah.
So where is it could be any tree.
Boy, I don't know. I don't know. I would guess it would be some weird species like soft maple or an elm or something, large, because they're
I
buttress.
mean, you yourself don't know.
Yeah, no, I'd have to look. But I am familiar with like the old trees list, and there's the big trees list. I don't know. That is interesting though. But I do know where the oldest and biggest red pine are. And some big white pine too, but yeah.
Where are you?
Well, Camp Bird is one of them. Yeah.
When you said we don't know how to generate red pine, you mean naturally?
Naturally.
Or you do plant or seedlings and all that sort of
We
stuff?
do.
Artificially?
Yeah, artificial. That's what we've been doing for decades. And it's interesting. So the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 30s and 40s, they were planting a lot of our older pine plantations, and those plantations many of them are 80, 100, 120 years old. They're at rotation age, and they're coming off, and we haven't been backfilling. So I don't mean to paint it as like a conservation crisis, but like I predict that in 20 years, we'll have a lot less red pine, certainly, maybe pine generally on the land. And we're not very good at regenerating it naturally. Jack pine is much more like that lodgepole pine with serotinous cones. It has variability of serotiny, but they often have serotinous cones. And we think we know how to do that. And usually we can get them to regenerate with fire, but it's spotty. And under like managed forest law, there's different guidelines where you have to guarantee a certain density of pines within a certain time. And I think it makes people nervous. So we just don't have the expertise in regenerating pines naturally. Yeah. Yes.
So what about animals? What happens with the animal population in these fires? Are some animals more resilient or come back? With birds? I keep thinking about the birds.
Good question with animals. Well, a lot of the big fire years were growing seasons, so they're late summer, fall. So most, like in the case of birds, you're not going to have as many flightless birds at that time, and nesting will have been done. So you've got your whatever. You're not going to be necessarily hitting the population as hard. But I think about it in terms of like in Minnesota right now, they're creating marten boxes. Like martens, the species of conservation concern. And they're actually creating boxes much like a wood duck box because they need snags and they need cavities. And so far, at least in Minnesota, I don't think they've actually reproduced young martens in those boxes, but they use them a lot. And so think about that. We're basically taking this wood that I'm sampling. These have been stumps in the woods longer than some of our oldest forests. And so these fire killed or fire scarred or these old legacy trees, they're really great habitat. That complexity that I've been talking about, that natural disturbance wind and fire creates, is lacking. And I think martens are suffering and other things as well. when you come down into, southern Wisconsin, we talk a lot about pollinators and invertebrates, and there's a lot to be said about that. And I think I had a regal fritillary project that I looked at 30 years of data, and then we had all the management history. And there's a protectionist view for regals, which are now, I think, federally listed, and other, pollinators like that, where they're dependent on these fragments of prairie, and we have so little of it. And how can we know we're going to kill some by burning it? And so what we found was that if you never burn it, it is far worse than if you burn it every single year. And there's an initial dip in the population, and then they rebound quickly, and they come back to a higher population than they were. So, I mean, it's I think the protectionist view in that case doesn't always work, but these organisms have evolved with fire. I mean, we're going back to 1326, and it was, many of our forests were burning every 12, 15 years. Low severity. Yeah.
If these fires are considered like natural for the environment, actually has some positive effect, would it then be like a case or argument for like controlled or monitored fires?
Yep. And we're doing more and more of that prescribed burning, and in oak savanna, tallgrass prairie, and some barrens now, which are basically pine savanna up north, northern. And we're talking about, I have a research project where we're trying to use prescribed fire in forested situations for natural regeneration. So it's beginning to happen, but I'd like to see a lot more of it, a lot more experimentation. But yeah, it's important. Yes.
What's the average lifespan of a white pine and a red pine?
So the average lifespan of the white and red pines, average might be really different than maximum, but they live hundreds of years. I think for a red pine, like an old red pine's 300 years, an old white pine's probably 300 years too. You can get 700-year-old white pine. You can get 400-year-old red pine. We don't have many examples of that. And if you're thinking about like, what do we have on the ground? Like what our quote stock is, our growing stock, it's probably much younger than that. Like we have very few old forests.
All right, I think we'll end it there.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, thank you all for coming out tonight. I really appreciate you sticking with us tonight. Enjoy coming up here to the front of the room. At the end of the night, we have our upcoming events up here, as well as what our next 3 months of Think and Drink events are. So the dates as well as the subjects are on there. And come see some of our upcoming events as well. Otherwise, I hope to see you back here next month. Thank you.
Tell me more.
The Germans over there, they fishing the forest, and really like this out, and then replant it. And after so many years, they do another year, they get down to the
Yeah. Well, Germany has done like a lot of spruce plantations that way.
I
And
lived in Germany for a year.
Yeah, and they're running into some problems. Monocultures are scary. You get something that starts killing spruce, you're in a pickle. And they have had some issues, and they're running out of I think the soil actually has changed. So when you plant monoculture, you're not. So they're learning the mistakes actually from some of those methods.
Because they over there, they have what's called forest meisters, and they take
Yeah.
care of the forest.
Yeah.
And they take care of the animals in the forest.
Yeah. Well, they a lot of the concepts for how to manage